So this is the third of our talks on King Lear, and looking at passages that might appear on an exam section on paper 1 of the AQA syllabus under the tragedy theme, how we might put a passage on King Lear on. And we're going to look at the next section of Act 1, Scene 1, such a rich and vivid scene that there's so many things we can look at. We're actually going to look at sort of lines 119 to 185 thereabouts, 186, where Kent argues with Lear. This section was used in 2023 from 119 to 161, so not quite the whole of this section, but there's a good finale to it, which I'll include as well. So our approach is there on the screen, the same approach as ever. Let's locate the passage first of all. It's in the middle of this first big long scene. It's just after Cordelia's been banished. There's a sense of shock. There's a sense of something that's really surprising and worrying happening, that things are falling apart, that perhaps people undeservingly are winning out and that the deserving are losing, that Lear is making a huge mistake. All this is going on in the audience's mind. Kent, we've already seen in the play so far, but as a very kind of informational character, really, somebody who just dropped in and told us a little bit about what was happening before the beginning of the first big scene. Now his personality emerges too, and one of the rich things about this play is that every character seems to have more than just a functional role. Even the small characters have characteristics, stand for things, and Kent stands for honesty, plainness, but to a fault maybe, and he also stands for loyalty. He sticks by Lear through thick and thin, even when Lear tries his very best to get rid of him. So we've located the passage as being another little turning point after the big turning point in the play. Is Lear divested himself of all his allies, Lear exposing himself to the minimal, which is what's going to happen in Act 3, really, actually. But he's making it more likely, unintentionally, that he's going to have to confront that idea of being completely on his own, which he's never had to in his life. So we'll look at this passage in terms of that same question, explore the significance of the extract in relation to the tragedy of the play as a whole. And we'll see that, again, certain themes and certain linguistic elements come up. What we'll see here is, again, violence, the language exploding with anger and fury, conflict. This play is so rich in very sort of violent and threatening and chaotic language that the whole play feels very sort of like a sort of thicket of tangled thorn bushes which are sort of dragged through, everything intertwining in a complex and troubling and tormenting way, really. It's a play that sort of gives you a vision of life as a sort of a hell on earth, really, in which the forces of life, from the forces of nature to the forces of sort of literal violence to the forces of more sort of psychic violence, are in a great turmoil, and that no one is in control of that, certainly least of all people who have any good and helpful ambitions for anybody around them. So Kent, for instance, here has absolutely no control over what happens. So we begin with Lear having just banished Cordelia and Kent attempting to intervene, but is silenced immediately. Kent showing respect with his short speech. He doesn't interrupt Lear at this stage immediately. He lets Lear then have a long turn afterwards. The piece Kent that immediately follows Kent's introduction here is a pause line, because there's two syllables and then the rest of the line nothing. So what happens there? Does he turn to him threateningly? Does his anger rise in him like that hysterical passio we're going to see later in the play, where he can't control this sort of rising physical symptom? Or is it just a case of some physical business, really, as he sort of fiddles with maps and things and deals with the division of the kingdom? But he does use, Lear, a metaphor there of the dragon and his wrath, and that's very typical of the language of the play, full of really quite violent and grand scale imagery as well. The imagery of a dragon, not a small threat, but a huge one. Gives out his orders, avoid my sight, and that word sight comes up a couple of times in this exchange. It's a key theme in the play. Can you see what's going on? Edmund And Regan and Goneril see things, notice things, are aware, they see what's in their advantage and use it. Lear, Gloucester are blind. Blind to the truth of those around them, blind to the reality. They're tricked and deceived. They don't see what's happening, and they therefore make huge mistakes. He goes on to sort of explain his decision to, and kind of self-pityingly, really saying, I thought that I could hope for more, but here we go. I'm going to now, and he gives a little description of what he's going to do with Goneril and Regan. He's going to stay at their places 1 month at a time. But notice how Lear says, only we shall retain the name and all the additions to the king. So this is that unrealistic idea that Lear represents of somebody who wants to be privileged and powerful but doesn't want any responsibility. So he's taking that to the extreme there. He's a character that represents that privilege, and kingship represented privilege in Shakespeare's time. Now it might be wealth or celebrity, but we see that same thing in these types of people who are entitled, who think that they are entitled to more than the rest of us, and that if they are not treated with the sort of absolute respect and their wishes met completely to the letter, they burst into furious rants and raves at people. And we see that in the press about celebrities a lot in our time. That's what Lear represents here, somebody who rages like a toddler when he doesn't get what he wants, because all through his life he has always got what he wants. Everybody's always said yes, yes, yes. And this is one of the first times in his life when Cordelia has not said what he expected someone to say. And then he can't cope with it. Like a toddler who's been thwarted, he rages and stamps and furiously rails. He separates the crown, so we've got this visual moment on stage. Again, the exam board love you to look at the play as a stage moment, as something that would be staged and visualised, either on an actual stage or on a film. And here, the splitting of the crown would seem to be symbolically a real sign of weakness and a mistake, a sign of breaking power apart and of giving up on important power. Kent has another go. Royal Lear. Does he have to wait for Lear to sort of turn around and come back? Because again, there's a part line there with just 3 syllables out of 10. He tries to flatter him a little bit. He plays a bit of the game that Cordelia wouldn't. He says he loved him as a father, which seems extreme. It's worth remembering that people seem to, Cordelia and Kent and the Fool to some extent do seem to have genuine affection for Lear. So if we tend to see Lear as this kind of abusive father figure and sort of symbol of all that's wrong about patriarchy, and that tends to be the sort of way he's emphasised in modern productions, I think, because it fits our kind of suspicions about patriarchy that as a culture today in the 21st century we have. He seems to represent everything that patriarchy represents, and everything that's wrong with patriarchy, that sort of entitled masculinity, using sort of violence and the threat of violence to oppress and misuse those around him. Well, there's also this sense, though, that there must be something nice about him. There must be something lovable about him or admirable about him. Why do sensible and blunt and honest people like Kent show such great loyalty to him? Notice that the first dismissal of Kent's interruption comes as a violent image of an arrow that's going to be fired at you. The bow's bent, get away from it. I'm going to fire an arrow at you. So again, all through the play, Shakespeare brings up the imagery of violence. Kent employs a technique that's something like the Greek sticomythia, which was where one line after another would be back and forth in a conflict between two characters. And often Shakespeare does this quite a lot, where a character will say a line and the other character who's arguing with them will reverse the line or change it or take their words and reshape them to show, you're wrong. And here, I'm going to fire an arrow at you. No, let the arrow fall. And then he says some really important stuff. Be Kent unmanly when Lear is mad. So he admits that he's being rude, but I have to be rude. It's right that I should be rude because you are being mad. And Kent's one of the first people to sort of put that idea in our head that Lear might be mad. And fairly quickly, Lear himself starts to worry about it too. And even at the end of this scene, we'll hear that Goneril and Regan sort of exchange a conversation that suggests that they've always felt that he was rather unpredictable. So he says very clearly in imperatives, reverse thy doom, change your mind. But notice even the words like reverse thy doom, everything's on a high pitch and a highly dramatic and violent edge here. It's not, doom was a decision, but he doesn't have to use that word. He could just say reverse your decision. By saying doom, of course, it gives other connotations as well. Hideous rashness, judgment compared to rashness here. Again, conflicts and opposites. The play is clashing with itself all the time, with these opposites thrown against each other and sometimes reversed, as we'll see in a moment. Again, the empty-hearted hollowness of the other characters, Regan and Gonwall, is very obvious to Kent. Why can't Lear see it? Now, on thy life, he says, so I'll threaten your life if you don't stop. And of course, that doesn't mean anything to Kent. I don't mind that. You can kill me. I give my life to you. So that absolute loyalty. Well, out of my sight, then see better, Lear. What a great line. What an important one. And Lear takes the whole play to try and see better. He doesn't see better. Of course, Gloucester has the same journey, doesn't he, of failing to see. But he has to be taught to see in the most horrific and dramatic and immediate way. The gods are called upon. Now, in the play, the gods are at best passive, at worst, perhaps, as Gloucester says, like, terrible children tearing off the legs of flies the way they treat human beings, sort of taking great pleasure in causing pain. This is a pre-Christian play. It's set something like 800 BC. And so Shakespeare can say, well, one of the reasons that things go wrong is because they don't have the Christian God to summon. They're unfortunate that they didn't have that option. But the other thing that could be argued is the play is atheistic, that the gods' indifference is a sign that Shakespeare's presenting a world in which there is no higher power to save you. And you can call upon any higher power you want, you will never get anywhere. You'll never achieve anything with that. The gods, if they exist at all, are indifferent. Lear's fury rises and he calls him vassal and miscreant, and he begins to threaten physical violence again. So there's that abusive Lear that we've thought might be the problem earlier in the scene, and it's part of the reason why Gonwall and Regan perhaps might feel self-righteous in attacking Lear, that he's been like this all his life. Anything goes wrong and he shouts and bawls and threatens to hit people or attack them physically. And that's not acceptable, is it? That's patriarchy for you, and that's the problem that the rest of us have to deal with when these figures of power and authority throw their weight around and behave so terribly. Even Albany and even Cornwall, I should say, really. Albany is a man of peace, but even Cornwall seems to be shocked by that. Kent again comes back at him, doesn't give up, does he? Doesn't stop nagging him. Kill your physician. I'm your physician. I can put you right. I can cure you. But again, Lear's the one who has the huge long speech to follow. He silences Kent with the phrase, on thine allegiance. And that's the thing that will shut Kent up, that if I call upon your loyalty, your allegiance is your loyalty. If I call upon your loyalty to me, that's the thing that matters to me most. And if you can call upon my life, you can call upon the gods, I don't care. But you call upon my loyalty, and yes, then you'll get me to do as you wish. And so that's what happens. And he sets out in fairly plain language then what's going to happen. And this shall not be revoked is his final word on that. And away by Jupiter. So the gods drawn upon again. But this shall not be revoked. There's a firmness there, the sense of some power, but it's power that's been misused, and we really sense that. And I just would sort of finish the sequence by looking at the way in which Kent says his farewells. Again, he speaks of the gods to Cordelia, which seems again to align the good characters with the gods in a way that's unhelpful to them. All the good characters seem to be looking to the gods to support them, and that might be their naivety perhaps, which is another theme throughout the play. The good characters are naive and therefore gullible and easily played upon and defeated by cynical characters like Gonald, Regan, and Edmund. We'll see that he does speak to Regan and Gonald directly, and so says, "I hope you prove to be true to your word." We can imagine their physical response on stage. It's a good thing to do in these sequences. They would probably roll their eyes at each other and perhaps even look rather triumphant that everything's going their way. They've got rid of the sister who's been a nuisance to them, thus gaining much more land and authority. But they've also now getting rid of anybody who might get in the way of them doing what they want with Lear. So, things are going their way. They might be aware of that getting rid of Kent is probably in their interest because he might be a voice of reason who might stand in their way of doing what they want later on, as he indeed does to some extent. So what we've seen here is, I suppose, a doubling up of what we've seen already for King Lear. He's unreasonable, he's angry, he's bitter, he's quick to lose his temper when things don't go his way, and he's making terrible mistakes, and he's siding with people who don't care about him and turning against the ones that do. So that he's doing everything that you would expect a flawed character to do in a tragedy, to make terrible mistakes that are going to lead to disaster later on. The tragedy is being doubled up on, if you like. We're also seeing the development of Kent's character and seeing what loyalty is, that you speak truth even when it's a difficult thing to say, when it's not, nobody wants to hear it, when you know you're going to get into trouble for saying it, you still say it, you speak out. And that, again, is a key theme really in the play, because it's often part of a discussion of politics. What do you do in the face of injustice? Do you just hide away and hope that it doesn't come and get you? The famous way that the Nazis were kind of allowed to take power and continue their injustice because nobody spoke up and nobody stood up against them for fear they'd be the next target. Oh, well, if I'm not being targeted, I'm all right, chap, sort of thing. Well, what we tend to, from our safe position of not being threatened by such horrors, what we tend to think is you should speak up against those who do injustice. And Kent represents that. He does bravely speak up, and he loses everything for doing that. He's banished from his kingdom, loses his position, loses his purpose in life, in theory, although he manages to find a way of getting it back. So that's part of what the play is establishing, that, it's a debate as to what do you do in the face of these moments of great injustice. And is it right? Or is there a way in which you can stand up successfully, or is standing up just a futile gesture in the end anyway? So there's so many things debated in the play already, but what we've probably come away with from this scene is a sense that disaster is all that can happen from here on in, that things have gone badly and they're only going to get worse, that some great mistakes have already been made. We might also have less than a sympathetic view of Lear at this stage. We might see him as being an unpleasant and abusive figure who deserves all he gets, in the future if things go wrong for him, which we would, even on a first reading, would suspect that things are going to go wrong for him. This is a tragedy, but that he kind of deserves it. He's brought it on himself, very, very obviously. Now, as the play develops, we begin to sympathise with him a little bit more. At this stage, though, I think we would be in sympathy with Kent and with Cordelia, and a very little sympathy with Lear. We might even find ourselves sympathising with Gonald and Regan in that, well, if they've had to put up with this all their lives, no wonder they are not perhaps willing to tell the truth anymore, perhaps a little bit manipulative to try and get some sort of value out of life that they may have been denied in the past. So this sequence would be really good for examining the rhetoric of anger, examining the sort of violent language, examining the personalities of Lear and Kent, and examining the way in which Shakespeare plays with our sympathies throughout the play, making us shift those sympathies subtly as the play develops. But the richness and the violence and the complexity of the play stands perhaps as the one thing that emerges above everything else, which is always going to be the case when you read this play. It's full of so many different complexities, and it leaves us again with a sense of shock at the sheer violence of what we've witnessed, really, and the patriarchal Lear at his very worst.